The Victorian mansion loomed before Katy like a sentinel against the autumn sky, its weathered shutters and ornate trim telling stories she couldn't yet decipher. Richard squeezed her hand as they stood in the curved driveway, their moving truck idling behind them. "Welcome home, sweetheart," he said, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. Katy tried to mirror his enthusiasm, but something about the house's facade made her pause. Perhaps it was the way shadows gathered in the deep-set windows, or how the afternoon light seemed to avoid certain corners of the wraparound porch. She was being silly, of course. This was exactly the kind of atmospheric setting she'd always dreamed of for writing her novel. "The realtor mentioned it needs some work," Richard continued, already heading up the front steps with their overnight bags. "But that's what makes it perfect for us. A project we can tackle together." His voice carried that familiar note of certainty, the one that had first drawn Katy to him 2 years ago at her book signing. As they crossed the threshold, the floorboards creaked beneath their feet, releasing the musty scent of aged wood and forgotten memories. Katy's writer's imagination immediately began spinning possibilities for her next novel, perhaps a story about family secrets or long-buried mysteries. She hadn't told Richard yet, but her publisher was getting impatient about her missed deadlines. "I'll start bringing in boxes," Richard announced, leaving Katy alone in the vast foyer. She wandered into what would become their living room, running her fingers along the chair rail. The previous owners had left behind heavy velvet drapes that seemed to absorb both light and sound. "You must be the new neighbors." The voice startled Katy. An elderly woman stood in the doorway, clutching a covered casserole dish. "I'm Margaret from next door. Thought you might appreciate a home-cooked meal on moving day." Katy welcomed the friendly face. "That's so kind of you. I'm Katy, and my husband Richard is outside with the truck." Margaret's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. "Ah yes, Richard. He came by last week to get the keys, didn't he? Said he wanted to surprise you with the house." Katy's hand stilled on the wall. "Last week? No, we just got the keys today from the realtor." "Oh dear," Margaret's weathered face crinkled with concern. "My memory must be playing tricks again. These old eyes aren't what they used to be." She set down the casserole dish with trembling hands. "You know, dearie, houses like this one hold on to things, memories, feelings, secrets sometimes." "Margaret." Richard's voice boomed from the doorway, making both women jump. "I see you've met my wife." His tone was warm, but Katy noticed how his fingers drummed against his thigh, a telltale sign of tension she'd learned to recognize during their marriage. "Just bringing a welcome gift," Margaret replied, her earlier unease masked by a pleasant smile. "I should get back home now. My cats get anxious when their dinner is late." She hurried toward the door, then paused. "Katy, dear, if you ever need anything at all, I'm right next door." That evening, after hours of unpacking, Katy stood at their bedroom window, watching darkness settle over the property. Richard's arms encircled her waist, his chest warm against her back. "Happy?" he murmured into her hair. "Yes," she answered automatically, even as questions nagged at her consciousness. Why had Margaret seemed so strange about Richard getting the keys? And why hadn't he mentioned visiting the house before? The novelist in her couldn't ignore these small discrepancies, these tiny threads that, when pulled, might unravel something larger. "I have to go into the city tomorrow," Richard said, already turning away to check his phone. "Some complications with a client. But you can start setting up your writing space. There's a perfect room on the 3rd floor, lots of natural light." Katy nodded, but her attention had drifted to a sound she couldn't quite place, a subtle scratching coming from somewhere within the walls. Probably mice, she told herself. Yet as she prepared for bed in their partially unpacked bedroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching, waiting, holding its breath. In the middle of the night, Katy woke to an empty bed and the sound of footsteps overhead. She lay still, listening as they moved across the 3rd floor, the same floor Richard had suggested for her writing room. The steps were deliberate, measured, as if someone was pacing a familiar path. "Richard," she called out softly. No answer came, only the continued rhythm of footsteps that suddenly, abruptly, ceased. When Richard slipped back into bed an hour later, Katie pretended to be asleep. His skin was cool, as if he'd been outside, and he smelled of something she couldn't quite identify, something old and musty, like the forgotten corners of their new home. Morning light filtered through the heavy drapes, casting strange shadows across the bedroom floor. Katie lay awake, watching dust motes dance in the pale beams, her mind returning to those mysterious footsteps from the night before. Richard had already left for the city, his side of the bed long cold. A note on the kitchen counter informed her he might be late, client meetings, he'd written, followed by drinks with potential investors. The house felt different in daylight, less threatening but somehow more revealing. Katie wandered from room to room, noting details she'd missed in yesterday's chaos: water stains on the library ceiling, a door that wouldn't quite close in the upstairs hallway, and most curiously, fresh paint around the edges of what appeared to be a sealed doorway on the third floor. Her writer's curiosity got the better of her. Katie ran her fingers along the painted edges, feeling the slight ridge where door met wall. Why would someone seal off an entire room? And why hadn't Richard mentioned it when he suggested this floor for her writing space? A soft knock at the front door interrupted her investigation. Margaret stood on the porch, this time clutching a small cardboard box. "Found these while cleaning my attic," she said, glancing over Katie's shoulder into the house. "Old photographs of the neighborhood. Thought you might like to see how things used to look." Katie invited her in, grateful for the company and the distraction from her unsettling discoveries. They settled in the kitchen, where morning light made everything seem more ordinary, more manageable. Margaret spread the photographs across the table, yellowed images capturing moments frozen in time. "That's your house, about 15 years ago," Margaret said, pointing to a particular photo. Katie leaned closer, noting the different color scheme, the well-tended garden. A woman stood on the porch, her face turned slightly away from the camera, her hand resting on the railing in a pose that seemed somehow familiar. "Who is she?" Katie asked, though something in her stomach tightened with anticipation. Margaret's fingers trembled as she gathered the photos back together. "Jennifer Morris. She lived here with her husband." A pause, heavy with unspoken words. "She was quite the gardener. Those rose bushes out front. She planted those. What happened to her? Nobody knows for certain." Margaret's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "She disappeared one winter night. Police investigated, of course, but..." She shrugged, the gesture encompassing all the uncertainties, all the whispered theories that must have circulated through the neighborhood. Katie's throat felt dry. "When was this?" "Must be about 5 years ago now. Her husband moved away shortly after." "Funny thing is..." Margaret hesitated, then reached into the box again, pulling out another photograph. This one showed a neighborhood barbecue, faces bright with laughter. "I found this one just last night. Took me a while to place him, he looks so different now, but..." She pointed to a man in the background. Katie's heart seemed to stop. There was Richard, younger but unmistakable, his arm around Jennifer Morris's waist. "I thought you should know," Margaret said softly. When Richard first came to look at the house, he acted like he'd never seen it before. "But this photo..." She left the sentence unfinished, her meaning clear. Katie's mind raced, trying to fit this new information into what she knew about her husband. They'd met 2 years ago at her first book signing. He'd told her he'd recently moved to the area for work. Nothing in their whirlwind romance had suggested any connection to this house or its previous occupants. "There's more," Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength. "Jennifer used to write too. Poetry mostly. She converted the third floor into her workspace." She met Katie's eyes directly. "Behind that sealed door." The scratching sound Katie had heard in the walls seemed to increase, as if the house itself was trying to speak. She remembered Richard's insistence that she use the third floor for writing, his midnight wanderings, the cool touch of his skin when he'd returned to bed. "I should go," Margaret said, standing abruptly. "But Katie." She pressed a small key into Katie's palm. "Jennifer gave me this years ago, asked me to keep it safe. Said it opened a box where she kept her most important papers. I never found the box, but maybe." She squeezed Katie's hand. "Maybe you're meant to." After Margaret left, Katie sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the key. The morning light had taken on a harsh quality, illuminating too much, revealing truths she wasn't sure she was ready to face. The photograph of Richard and Jennifer lay before her like evidence of a crime she hadn't known existed. Upstairs, the sealed door seemed to pulse with secrets. Katie pressed her ear against it, hearing only the hollow echo of her own heartbeat. Or was it something else? Something deeper in the walls, something that had been waiting for her all along. Her phone buzzed, a text from Richard, "Meeting running late. Don't wait up." Katie stared at the message, at the casual dismissal of her time, her concerns. Then she looked at the key in her hand, its brass surface dulled with age but still promising answers. She had until night to decide what to do with it. The key felt warm in Katie's palm as she stood before the sealed door, afternoon light casting long shadows through the third-floor windows. Each step leading to this moment had been deliberate, waiting until the sun was high enough to illuminate whatever she might find, checking Richard's location through his shared GPS, still in the city, and quietly documenting everything she'd learned so far in a password-protected file on her laptop. The wallpaper around the door's edges peeled away easily, revealing hinges that had been painted over but never removed. Katie worked methodically, her movements precise despite her trembling hands. The lock, when she finally exposed it, looked surprisingly well maintained, as if someone had been tending to it all these years. The key slid in smoothly. The room beyond was smaller than she'd expected, more of a walk-in closet than a proper study. Dust motes swirled in the beam of light from the single window, but the space didn't feel abandoned. Someone had been here recently, there were clear handprints in the dust on the desk, and the floorboards showed signs of regular traffic. "Oh, Jennifer," Katie whispered, taking in the scene. Folders and notebooks filled the built-in shelves, their spines labeled with dates and cryptic codes. A vintage typewriter sat on the desk, a half-finished page still threaded through its rollers. The paper had yellowed with age, but Katie could make out the last lines. "He thinks the words are his to control, but I've hidden the truth where he'll never think to look. In the garden, beneath the roses." Katie's phone buzzed, making her jump. A text from Richard, heading home early. "Miss you." Her heart raced as she checked the time, she had maybe 2 hours before he'd be back. Moving quickly but carefully, she began examining the room's contents. The first few notebooks contained poetry, beautiful but seemingly innocent verses about nature and love. But as Katie moved through them chronologically, the tone shifted. Darker themes emerged, hidden in metaphor, roses with thorns that drew blood, gardens choked by invasive vines, houses that trapped their inhabitants in golden cages. In a folder dated just weeks before Jennifer's disappearance, Katie found photographs. They showed the house from various angles, focusing on the garden and what appeared to be recent excavation work. Jennifer had written notes on the backs, measurements, dates, and one recurring phrase, "Remember the roses." Katie's hands shook as she reached the last notebook. Inside, she found a letter addressed simply, "To whoever finds this. If you're reading this, you're probably asking the same questions I once did. Why does he disappear at night? Why does he insist you use this floor for your work? Why does he check your computer when he thinks you're sleeping? I thought I was losing my mind at first. The gaslighting was subtle, a misplaced item here, a forgotten conversation there. He has a way of making you doubt everything, even your own memories. But I started keeping records. Everything is documented in these notebooks, coded to look like poetry drafts. The truth is in here, and out there in the garden. I've left proof, letters, photographs, recordings. They're hidden where he'd never look, because he thinks he knows every inch of this house. But he doesn't know about the space behind the loose brick in the garden wall, or the waterproof box buried beneath the rose bushes. If you're reading this, you're probably his new wife. I wasn't his first, and unless someone stops him, you won't be his last. Be careful. Be smart. And whatever you do, don't let him know what you've discovered. The letter was signed simply, J, followed by a postscript, the roses bloom in cycles, but secrets bloom in darkness. Katie photographed everything with shaking hands, her mind racing. The roses Jennifer mentioned still grew in the front garden, she'd admired them just yesterday. Her phone buzzed again, Richard sharing his location, showing him already on the highway home. Moving swiftly, Katie restored the room to its exact state, making sure to wipe away any trace of her presence. She sealed the door again, reapplying the wallpaper with careful precision. Only then did she allow herself to feel the full weight of what she'd discovered. That evening, as she prepared dinner with practiced normalcy, Katie's mind kept returning to Jennifer's words. She watched Richard move through their kitchen, noting how he checked her laptop when she stepped away, how his casual questions about her day felt like subtle interrogations. "You seem quiet," he observed, brushing a kiss against her temple. "Everything okay?" "Just thinking about my novel," she replied, the lie coming easily now. "I might start working in the garden tomorrow. Those roses need attention." Something flickered in Richard's eyes, so brief she might have missed it if she hadn't been watching for it. "The roses?" His voice was carefully neutral. "I was thinking of removing them actually. Plant something new." Katie felt the weight of Jennifer's key in her pocket, pressed against her thigh like a promise. "No," she said softly, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "The roses stay." The garden welcomed Katie early the next morning, dew damp and quiet in the pale light. She'd waited until Richard left for his morning run, his footsteps fading down the street with mechanical precision. Now, armed with gardening tools and Jennifer's coded warnings, she approached the rose bushes with deliberate calm. Each movement was carefully planned, she actually did need to tend to the roses, letting the genuine work of pruning and weeding mask her true purpose. The thorns caught at her gardening gloves as she worked, leaving tiny tears that felt like messages. She understood now why Jennifer had chosen roses as her silent guardians, beautiful but armed, resilient yet requiring careful handling. The garden wall stood weathered and innocent, its aged bricks telling no tales. Katie worked her way closer, methodically checking each brick near the rose bushes. Her fingers found it, a slight movement, barely perceptible unless you knew to look. The brick slid free with surprising ease, revealing a small cavity behind it. Inside lay a waterproof pouch, the kind photographers used to protect their memory cards. Katie's hands trembled as she retrieved it, quickly tucking it into her pocket just as Margaret's voice called from over the fence. "Those roses are fighters," Margaret said, her meaning clear in her steady gaze. "No matter how many times someone tries to cut them back, they always find a way to bloom." Katie nodded, understanding the weight of Margaret's words. "I've been learning about their history," she replied carefully. "About who planted them, and why." Margaret's eyes flickered to Katie's pocket, then back to her face. "Jennifer loved documenting everything. Said it was a writer's habit, keeping records." She paused, then added more quietly, "The police never found her journals when they searched the house. Richard told them she must have taken them when she left." "Left?" Katie's voice remained steady despite her racing heart. "That's what the official report says. That she packed a bag and disappeared in the night. No note, no warning." Margaret's hands gripped her fence tightly. "But Jennifer would never have left without her manuscripts. She told me once they were her life's work, not just the poetry, but everything she documented." Katie thought of the hidden room upstairs, of the notebooks filled with coded warnings. Did you ever tell the police about the sealed room? Richard had it sealed before they came. Said Jennifer had been unstable, that the room was full of paranoid writings. He had documentation from a therapist, prescriptions for medication. Margaret's voice cracked slightly. It all seemed so convincing at the time. He has a way of making everything sound reasonable. The sound of running footsteps approaching made them both tense. Katie quickly resumed her gardening, but Richard ran past without stopping, his routine unaltered. Still, the moment had broken something open between the two women. I should have done more, Margaret whispered. Should have pushed harder when things didn't add up. Katie reached through the fence, gripping Margaret's hand. You kept the key. You waited. That's why I can help her now. Later, locked in her bathroom with the shower running, Katie examined the contents of the waterproof pouch. Inside she found a small recorder, a USB drive, and a handwritten note, "The truth doesn't stay buried forever. Like the roses, it finds a way to reach the light." The USB drive contained video files, dozens of them, each labeled with a date. With trembling fingers, Katie clicked on the earliest one. Jennifer's face filled her screen, younger but unmistakably similar to the woman in the photographs. "I'm starting this record because I don't trust my own memories anymore," Jennifer's voice was clear, determined. "Richard says I'm imagining things, that I'm becoming paranoid. But I know what I see. I know what I hear. And I know about the others." Katie's breath caught. The next video's thumbnail showed a different house, a different garden. A newspaper clipping attached to the file reported a missing person case from 7 years before Jennifer, another wife, another writer, another disappearance explained away. A soft knock at the bathroom door made Katie jump. "Everything okay in there?" Richard's voice carried its usual concern, but now she heard the undertone of control. "You've been in there a while." "Just feeling a bit under the weather," she called back, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "Must have been something I ate." "I'll make you some tea," he offered, footsteps retreating. Katie quickly secured the evidence in a place he'd never think to look, inside the hollow pole of her grandmother's old quilting frame, stored in the spare room among her craft supplies. Richard had always dismissed her feminine hobbies with benign condescension, never seeing how they might serve as cover for something else. That night, as Richard slept beside her, Katie lay awake listening to the house's settling sounds. She thought of Jennifer, of the unnamed woman before her, of all the stories that had been buried beneath roses and reasonable explanations. In the darkness, she made a silent promise, not just to uncover the truth, but to ensure it would finally bloom in the light where everyone could see it. The scratching in the walls seemed louder now, more insistent. Katie wondered if it was the house itself trying to speak, to reveal its secrets. Or perhaps it was simply the sound of truth clawing its way to the surface, refusing to stay buried any longer. Katie spent the next few days building her case with quiet determination, each piece of evidence carefully documented and secured. The weight of Jennifer's truth, and the truths of those who came before her, sat heavy in her chest, but it also gave her purpose. She understood now that she wasn't just fighting for herself, but for all of them. During daylight hours, she maintained the facade of normalcy with a precision that would have frightened her once. She wrote in her designated space on the second floor, carefully avoiding the third floor entirely. She prepared meals, smiled at Richard's stories about his day, and never once mentioned the roses that continued to bloom defiantly in the front garden. But in stolen moments, she built her case. The USB drive had revealed a pattern spanning more than a decade, 3 women before Jennifer, all writers, all independent, all gradually isolated from friends and family before their disappearances. Richard's methods were consistent: the love bombing, the gradual control, the subtle gaslighting that made each woman doubt her own perceptions. "You seem distracted lately," Richard observed one evening, his hand warm on her shoulder. "Is the novel not going well?" Katie looked up from her laptop, where she'd been working on what appeared to be a chapter draft but was actually a detailed timeline of evidence. Just trying to work out some plot points, she replied, letting just enough frustration color her voice. You know how I get when I'm deep in a story. His smile held genuine affection, and that was perhaps the most unsettling part, the way he could shift between personas so seamlessly, the controller and the concerned husband existing in perfect balance. You work too hard, he said, closing her laptop gently. Let's have a quiet evening together. No writing, no phones. Katie felt the walls of the house pressing in, heard the scratching that never quite ceased. But she smiled, letting him lead her to the sofa, all while the evidence she'd gathered sat safely hidden in plain sight, dispersed across multiple locations he'd never think to check, backed up to cloud storage under an account he didn't know existed. Later that night, she met Margaret in the garden under the pretense of borrowing sugar. Their conversations had become a carefully choreographed dance of ordinary neighborly interaction and coded messages. I've been going through old photo albums, Margaret said, her meaning clear. Found some interesting pictures from community events. The kind of things people forget about over time. Katie understood. Margaret had been quietly reaching out to other neighbors, gathering their memories, their overlooked observations. History has a way of repeating itself, she replied, unless someone takes the time to learn from it. The next morning, while Richard was at work, Katie made two crucial phone calls. The first was to her literary agent, Laura, who had been increasingly concerned about the changes in Katie's writing style and personality since her marriage. I need you to keep something safe for me, Katie said, her voice steady. Documents. Important ones. And I need you to promise you won't open them unless something happens to me. Laura's silence spoke volumes. Katie, are you in danger? I'm handling it, Katie assured her. But I need to know these documents will reach the right people if necessary. She'd learned from Jennifer's mistakes, evidence was only powerful if it could be found. The second call was to Detective Sarah Chen, who had worked Jennifer's case 5 years ago. The conversation was brief, careful, but Katie recognized the sharp intake of breath when she mentioned the sealed room, the roses, the pattern of missing writers. Come to the station, Detective Chen said. Bring what you have. We'll need to move carefully, build a solid case. Men like this, they're careful. Methodical. So am I, Katie replied, thinking of her meticulous documentation, her strategic planning. And I have something the others didn't, I know what I'm dealing with. I know his patterns. That evening, as she prepared dinner, Katie felt Richard watching her from the doorway. His gaze held that mixture of possession and pride that she now recognized as dangerous. But she was no longer the same woman who had moved into this house, bright-eyed and trusting. She had become something else, part detective, part historian, part avenger. I've been thinking, she said, carefully casual, about setting my next novel in a house like this. A story about hidden rooms and buried secrets. She watched his reflection in the kitchen window, saw the slight tensing of his shoulders. About how the past never really stays buried, no matter how deep someone tries to hide it. Richard's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Some stories, he said softly, are better left untold. But Katie knew better now. She thought of Jennifer's words, of the roses that refused to die, of all the women whose stories had been silenced. Tomorrow, she would meet with Detective Chen. Tomorrow, the truth would finally begin to emerge. For now, though, she simply stirred the soup, listening to the house's persistent whispers, and waited. The morning dawned crisp and clear, autumn light filtering through the trees as Katie walked through the front garden one last time. The roses swayed gently in the breeze, their late blooms defiant against the approaching winter. She knelt beside them, remembering Jennifer's words about truth finding its way to the light. Detective Chen had arranged everything with quiet efficiency. A team of officers waited just around the corner, while others were stationed at Richard's office, ready to intercept him there. They wouldn't risk confronting him at the house, too many places to hide, too many unknown variables. Katie had taught them that much. You don't have to be here for this, Margaret said softly, appearing at the garden gate. She'd arrived early, insisting on standing witness. Sarah and I can handle the officers. Detective Sarah Chen had brought her partner, a forensic specialist named Dr. Sarah Williams, who now knelt by the rose bushes with her equipment. The two women had been instrumental in rebuilding the case, their dedication matching Katie's own determination. I need to see it through, Katie replied, watching as the forensics team began their careful excavation. Not just for me, or for Jennifer, but for all of them. She thought of the other women whose stories she'd uncovered, Claire Peterson, Maria Santos, Rebecca Turner. Each one had left traces, if you knew where to look. The first evidence emerged slowly, a metal box beneath the oldest rose bush, its contents preserved despite years underground. Inside, they found exactly what Jennifer had promised: photographs, letters, recordings. But there was more, pieces of a puzzle that stretched back further than even Katie had realized. Katie. Detective Chen's voice was gentle but urgent. We found something else. She held up a small notebook, its pages warped but legible. It's not Jennifer's handwriting. The name inside made Katie's heart stop: Elena Martinez, 1998. Before Claire, before any of them. The first, perhaps, or maybe just the earliest they'd found so far. Her phone buzzed, a text from Richard, stuck in traffic. Save dinner for me. She knew he was already in custody, the message a final attempt at maintaining control. She deleted it without replying. The day unfolded like a dream, or perhaps a long-delayed awakening. Each piece of evidence they uncovered built upon the last, creating a timeline of calculated predation and remarkable resistance. Jennifer hadn't been paranoid, she'd been documenting everything, building a case that would extend far beyond her own story. Late afternoon found Katie in Detective Chen's office, surrounded by photographs of women who had lived in her house, loved her husband, and disappeared into carefully constructed explanations. But they weren't silent anymore. Their voices emerged from letters, diaries, recordings, each one a thread in the tapestry of truth they'd woven together. You did it, Margaret whispered, her weathered hand covering Katie's. You finished what Jennifer started. But Katie knew it wasn't just Jennifer. Each woman had contributed to this moment, their collective resistance building over years like layers of sediment, waiting to be uncovered. Claire's financial records, Maria's photographs, Rebecca's journals, Elena's notebooks, parallel stories of survival and documentation. What happens now? Katie asked Detective Chen, watching as evidence bags were carefully labeled and sealed. Now, Sarah replied, we make sure he never does this again. She paused, then added more softly, and you begin to heal. Healing. The word felt foreign, almost premature. But as Katie looked around the room at the women who had become her allies, Margaret with her quiet vigilance, Detective Chen with her unwavering dedication, Dr. Williams with her meticulous care for evidence and truth, she felt something unfurling in her chest. Not closure, exactly, but possibility. That evening, Katie sat in Margaret's kitchen, watching the lights of police vehicles play across the facade of her former home. They'd found more than just evidence in the garden. Behind the sealed door, beneath floorboards, inside walls, the house had held on to its secrets until the right person came to uncover them. I've been thinking about Jennifer's last poem, Katie said, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. The one in the typewriter. It wasn't just about hiding evidence. It was about planting seeds of truth, knowing that someday they would grow. Margaret nodded, understanding blooming in her eyes. Like those roses. Even in winter, their roots run deep. Katie thought about the book she would write, not the novel she'd planned, but the true story of the house and its women. Not a story of victimhood, but of resistance, documentation, and ultimately, justice. A story about how truth, like roses, requires both thorns and tenderness to survive. Outside, the autumn wind rustled through the garden, carrying the first hints of winter. But in the ground, in the walls, in carefully preserved words and images, spring was already waiting to emerge. And Katy, surrounded by the strength of the women who had come before and those who stood beside her now, was ready to tell their story.